Sure. David, thanks very much, and thanks to Open Ukraine for inviting me back. It's great to be back in Kiev. The panel is supposed to be about the world on the edge, closing security gaps, and looking at global security threats, sources of instability. So let me start there. I would argue that there are three main sources of instability. The first is the rise of authoritarianism. And we see this in particular in the case of Russia, but also China, even Iran. And this rise poses a threat not only to the people who live in these countries, but to those of us who live in free societies. The way a regime treats its own people is often indicative of how it will behave in foreign policy. And so we shouldn't be surprised that amid the worst crackdown in Russia on human rights since the breakup of the Soviet Union, that Russia doesn't only show respect for its own people, it doesn't show respect for any of its neighbors or for concepts of sovereignty and territorial integrity. We shouldn't be surprised in China, again with the worst crackdown in human rights in several decades, that China is muscle flexing in the East and South China Seas. These are challenges to global order and stability, but they're also challenges to freedom and human rights around the world. My former organization, Freedom House, has documented a 10-year period of decline in freedom around the world. This is the longest period of decline since Freedom House has been doing its annual Freedom in the World survey dating back to the early 1970s. This is a cause for major concern, and it gets at the second source of instability, in my view, which is a lack of confidence in the democracies, in the democratic world. There is no plan. One of the questions in the program is whether the West, the democratic world, has a plan. We don't. The authoritarian regimes have a plan. We don't. And we need to do a much better job. My own country, my own government, the US government, has gone through a period of disengagement from the world, a kind of corrective from the Bush administration, and I served, in the interest of full disclosure, all 8 years in the George W. Bush administration. President Obama, in his mind, is trying to correct the mistakes of the Bush administration. But he has gone much too far, in my view, by disengaging and not playing the leadership role that's necessary from the United States. We see a total failure in Syria, where close to 500,000 people by now have been killed. Half the population has been dislocated or become refugees. President Obama erased the red line that he talked about if Assad used chemical weapons. And erasing that red line has proved to be very deadly, not just in Syria, but elsewhere, including, I would argue, in this country. We see a rise of populism and illiberalism, declines in democratic gains in countries we thought were secure on a democratic path. We see an absence or a lack of shame, a lack of principles, where it's okay, apparently, in some countries to openly ask for Russian funding for political parties. We import Russia's greatest export, which is corruption. We need to do a much better job of preventing the influence of Russian corruption in our own countries. A rise of xenophobia, a closing of borders. Security, of course, is a paramount responsibility of any government. But we also have to maintain an openness to genuine refugees who are fleeing for their lives, and that message should obviously resonate here in a country that has its own IDP and refugee problem. The third source of instability, of course, are non-state actors. This is the Islamic State, Boko Haram, Al-Qaeda. I don't think I need to explain that these organizations, these entities, these groups are a direct threat to global stability, to freedom, to everything we stand for as societies. I want to briefly focus on the Russia challenge, and I know we have an excellent panel after this focused on Russia. But as Sandy Vershbow said, Russia tore up all the rules and agreements and understandings that came about in the post-war period, even before the Cold War ended through its invasion of Ukraine. And it's an invasion. It's not an incursion. It's not a sending in of volunteers. It's an outright invasion. There's been a debate in my country whether Russia poses an existential threat. I side with those who argue that it is to the United States. I don't think there's a debate here in Ukraine that Russia poses an existential threat. Russia is not our partner in Syria. Russia, in fact, has exacerbated the situation in Syria by supporting Assad, blocking UN resolutions, providing military support, and then starting at the end of last September, it has driven up the flow of refugees, making the situation for Europe much worse. Russia's attitude and approach toward Ukraine is to destabilize your country. It is not interested in stability, as the previous panel talked about. It views any of its neighbors' efforts to democratize, to liberalize, to deepen integration with the West as a threat to the Putin model. And it will never be at peace with its neighbors as long as Putin is in power. Putin perpetuates the myth that the United States, that the West, and NATO enlargement are threats to Russia. Let's remember that at the end of the Cold War, the United States had 500,000 troops on the European continent. We now have 62,000 troops. That, to me, does not strike a threat to Russia. Russia, of course, launched a cyber attack against Estonia in 2007. It invaded Georgia in 2008, invaded Ukraine starting in 2014. It has used energy and trade as weapons against its neighbors, including against Ukraine, which, by the way, is a violation of the Budapest Memorandum if you read it carefully. We, in response, particularly as a fellow signatory of the Budapest Memorandum, have failed to provide lethal assistance to Ukraine at its greatest time of need. And the person who I have to assign blame for this and responsibility is President Obama. The U.S. Congress, by huge landslides, has supported providing this assistance. The Vice President, the Secretary of Defense, the Secretary of State, the Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Supreme Allied Commander of NATO, have all been in favor of providing this assistance, and the person who has been opposed is President Obama, and that's a terrible mistake in my view. Instead, the President, particularly if you look at his comments in the Atlantic article recently by Jeffrey Goldberg, has provided what is called gratuitous clarity. He has gone out of his way to tell the Russians, to tell Putin what the United States won't do. I'm a firm believer and supporter of strategic ambiguity. We should leave Putin wondering what we might do. Instead, we tell him what we won't do, and in the process, we consign Ukraine to a sphere of influence. That's something I'm ashamed that my president has said. We need to push back. We need to show strength and not weakness or indecisiveness. We need tougher sanctions. We need sanctions at higher levels of the Russian government, including on Mr. Putin himself. We need to go after Russian corruption. The release of the Panama Papers just scratches the surface of the level of corruption in Russia. We need to ramp up the investigation into FIFA, into the International Olympic Committee. We need to seize more assets in the West and not allow Russian officials and oligarchs to use our Western systems at the same time they denigrate and bash us. We need to enforce the 2 Yukos verdicts, totaling $52 billion, which is roughly 1/5 of Russia, 5% of Russia's GDP. And we need to make sure that our companies in the West don't advertise on Russian TV. It is striking that Russian TV slams the United States and slams the West and demonizes us, and then they break for commercials selling our products. We're subsidizing this, and we shouldn't be. And I know we're running out of time. I mentioned military aid to Ukraine. We need to keep the doors open to Euro-Atlantic institutions, NATO and the EU, and let Ukraine decide if it wants to join NATO and not make the decision above Ukraine's head. We need to treat Russia as the aggressor that it is. Russia is the guilty party in this conflict. Ukraine is the victim, And we shouldn't shift blame for failure of Minsk onto Ukraine. It is the failure of Russia to fulfill a single condition under Minsk. Not a single one has been fulfilled. And lastly, if I can, David, I'll wrap up. Ukraine also needs to get its act together. You need political stability. We are here in a difficult week. You need a renewed commitment to reforms. You need to get serious, finally, about corruption. You have not done so. You need to open cases against those who genuinely deserve to be investigated, not against people like the former Deputy Prosecutor General. You need to get going before you risk losing the support and interest of the West. And if I can end on 4 recommendations for the West, I apologize for abusing my time. We need, as we are starting to do, condition assistance on fulfillment of promises, not simply on empty rhetoric. Second, my country, other Western countries, should more aggressively insert the FBI, the Department of Justice, into investigations being conducted here in Ukraine. Third, we should look at the purchases in the West and in my country of high-ticket items by Ukrainian oligarchs. And fourth, and perhaps most controversially, and I don't say this with any pleasure, but I do think the time for carrots is starting to expire. The time for sticks is now upon us, and it's time for some targeted sanctions against Ukrainians involved in serious corruption. Targeted sanctions. It's not against the country. It's not to lump Ukraine in the same category with Russia. These are different kinds of sanctions, but I unfortunately think it's the only way to demonstrate that we are frustrated with the lack of commitment in fighting corruption, and it's time for this strategy. Thank you.